Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be doing this. And the presentation today is called Connecting the Dots with Task-Based Language Teaching or Language Learning. And the idea here is that we're going to go beyond grammar and we're going to be looking at how we can integrate tasks to generate meaningful communication. It's interesting because one of my favorite researchers, one of my favorite authors, Ellis, actually argues that it would be almost an Herculean task, almost impossible for someone to learn a language if every rule out of the million, thousands of rules that are part of the language or the grammar of the language had to be first learned as explicit knowledge. And by explicit knowledge here, I mean you are able to verbalize the grammar. In other words, the present perfect is used to describe this, the simple past is used to describe that. So according to Ellis, this would be impossible. So that's kind of what's going to guide a little bit of what we're doing today. Many of you probably know this. You probably have a grammar book at home that you study. But let me tell you this. Language, our mental representation of language, does not consist of rules or paradigms as they are traditionally found in textbooks and all these over-the-counter grammar books. Quick reminder before we move on. We have to recognize, we have to accept that the textbook rules are not what learners mentally represent. Basically, what's on page 12 of the grammar book is not what ends up in our heads. It's not what ends up in our heads. Why? Because these rules are not psychologically real. Which brings me to a quote by one of my favorite researchers, a man that many people hated in the past, but I think he was right. And I think that's why people hated him. He basically said this. He said that the acquisition of a language is not a conscious process, it's actually a subconscious process. A lot of the times, the language learners are not aware of the fact that they are actually acquiring the language. But they are aware of one thing. They are aware that they are using the language for communication. And he adds that the result, the outcome of language acquisition, of competence in a language, is also subconscious. He adds that we are not aware of the rules of the language when we acquire the language. But what we do have is what I said earlier about the want to and wanna and the plural, is that we get a feel for this correctness. So grammatical sentences in this sense, they either sound right or feel right, and the errors feel wrong even if we do not consciously know the rule, which is the case for my children. They know why some things cannot be said in English, but they cannot tell me why. And this is exactly what Stephen Krashen said about language acquisition. Let's move on now to talk about communication. In order for us to understand communication, in order for us to understand communicative ability, we need to understand how we can teach communicatively. First of all, we need a definition of communication. Second of all, we need to understand how context is so important, how context determines to a very large extent the kind of communication that can happen in the classrooms. And of course, once we know this, we have to think about the implications of the definition for language teaching. Many people think communicative language teaching means not teaching grammar in the old-fashioned way. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not accurate. Communicative cannot be defined by what it is not. It needs to have a clear, positive definition. So, the communication definition that I'm going to use is based on the work of Sandra Savignon. I like these words. Expression. I think it's important because when you communicate, you express meaning, but you also interpret meaning, right? And sometimes you have to negotiate the meaning because it's not clear. And all of that happens within a very specific context. And more importantly, communication always has a purpose. But there's one word that I didn't talk about here, and that word is the word context. And context is everything in communication. Why? Because context is basically the setting, the participants, everyone who is involved in the communication process. And the context has a significant influence on any communicative event. And this is also going to affect the setting and the participants that are involved. And more importantly, the context dictates the manner of communication. What do we need to remember about communication? First of all, communication is not something that is static. Quite the opposite. Communication is highly fluid and highly dynamic. And if the context shifts, so does the nature of communication, because we don't communicate in the same way once the context is different. In the classroom, we never think about this, but the classroom is a context with fixed participants and a fixed setting. It's always the teacher and always the students. So here are the four, ladies and gentlemen. Here are the four. The first one is output, production. Learners need to produce, they need to speak, and they need to write in the second language. The second one is input. It's everything that the learners hear, not everything, it's what the learner hears or reads in the second language. But they also need interaction. They need the negotiation of meaning. In other words, they need opportunities to overcome comprehension or language production difficulties through interaction. So they can what do you mean? Say that again. Can you give me an example? I don't understand what you're saying. That kind of thing. And of course, they also need corrective feedback. They need to have opportunities to receive, provide, and respond to feedback on language production. And of course, corrections can vary dramatically in nature. It can be very explicit correction where you talk about grammar, or it could be an implicit correction that requires only clarification. What is a task, Leo? You still haven't answered my question. Well, a task is very simple. A task is a process. It's a process with very clear goals, but not linguistic goals. A task includes a series of steps. A task also requires cognitive and communicative purposes. Of course, a task has a very clear, a very defined outcome. And more importantly, a task is measured not in terms of, hey, teacher, I finished the exercise. No, it's measured in terms of, have you completed the task? They're learning the grammar, but they're connecting this to meaning. So you can do this in three different ways. You can ask students to listen and identify. You can also do an information gap. I'm going to talk about this one very quickly. Basically, divide students in pairs. One student gets family tree A, the other student gets family tree B. Each student has different pieces of information. So they have to interact. They have to ask each other questions to find out all the missing information. And one that works really well is listening and drawing. This is all input oriented. But we can also focus on a more interactive activity, one where the learners engage in producing language. I would tell my students to prepare to interview a classmate, and they're going to interview their classmates about their immediate family. And I ask them to think about questions. Think about questions you can ask about their parents and their age. The second step, they conduct the interview. They go around, they talk to their classmates, they take notes on the parents and their ages, the siblings and their ages, and all of that. And they record all of that information, because after that, they're going to do a presentation. They're going to present all that information to the class. I just want to add two more things before we say goodbye. For the last 3 decades, 30 years, research has pointed out that we need a fundamental reconsideration of teaching materials, and our curricular goals. The roles of input and output need to change in the classroom. If the student's goal is proficiency as communicative ability, we need to change the way we do things. We need to understand that the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning in a specific context for a specific purpose should be always at the forefront of what we're doing. And if we understand these roles in language acquisition, if we understand this, input and output become our allies, not just simple techniques. So remember, input is necessary for acquisition, output is necessary for accuracy, and interaction is necessary for feedback. Thank you very much for listening. And I have here a picture of my references. If you want to follow me, I'm on Instagram, Teaching Agility, YouTube, and our podcast, Teacher Talking Time podcast, and our YouTube video with Learn Your English. Thank you very much for listening. And I think we have time for questions. I finished on time today. Hey, look at me. I'm proud.